I trust everyone had a wonderful Yom Tov. And we come back to a very, very tragic Parsha. This week, Parshas Shlach. The story of the Meraglim, of the spies. And as much as has been written on this chapter, there are some very basic issues that really are unresolved. They are really a matter of dispute. First, was it proper to send spies, or was that itself a mistake? There are Midrashim that seem to imply that the sending of spies itself was a chet, was a sin. For two reasons. Number one, if the mission of the spies was to determine the quality of the land, they should have relied on the Ribono Shel Olam. He said that it's a wonderful land, Eretz Zavas Chalub Udvash. Why do you have to see for yourself? If the purpose of the Meraglim was to determine the strategy for conquest, to find the weak entry points, etc., so that as well is a lack of faith. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu was leading them into the land, you can assume that Ribono Shel Olam is going to be able to vanquish the enemies. So there are Midrash which seem to imply that the sending of Meraglim was a mistake. The Ramban takes the approach not so. The Ramban says that the fundamental mission of the Meraglim was military. It was to determine the proper strategy for the conquest of the land, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because we have a rule that ain't somchin ala nes. We don't rely on miracles. If a person wants something, needs something, then you have to exert effort, human effort, to achieve it. Of course, we always believe that our effort is not enough. It's the Ribono Shel Olam who crowns our efforts with success. But we have to do what is called hishtadlus. We have to exert effort and do our part. And therefore, if you're coming to take over a land, to rely on a miracle that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to vanquish the enemies with some supernatural plague is incorrect. You have to do what you can do, and getting intelligence is part of that. The Ramban says that there was a secondary mission, that they should report as to the quality of the land. And the Ramban understands that really was unnecessary, because the Ribono Shel Olam already testified that Eretz Yisrael is a fine land. But in a sense, seeing is believing. So Moshe Rabbeinu was confident that the Meraglim will come back with a wonderful report, how beautiful it is, how luscious the fruits are. They're supposed to bring back samples of the fruits. So certainly this would give them even more encouragement and more enthusiasm to conquer the land. So we have two possibilities. Either sending the Meraglim was a mistake, it wasn't a mistake, and it's an unresolved question. Two different approaches to the parsha. Then the Meraglim will come back, and there is a division. We have the majority report and the minority report. 10 of the Meraglim give a negative report. We'll see what the negativity was. 2, Yoshua and Kalev, give a positive report. So the Ramban asks the question, that why do we blame the 10? And we don't see that they lied, at least initially. They reported what they saw. They saw that it's a land which is occupied by very strong people. And the Amaleki are here, and the Canaani are here. And were they supposed to come back with the Baba Maisa? Were they supposed to come back with the stories? They were supposed to come back and report what they saw. So the Ramban explains that the 10 added an editorial comment. They didn't just say that the land is beautiful, but it is occupied by very strong people. They added a single word. And I'll read you the verse. They said, Ephes, but ki az ha'om hayeshiv ba'aretz. The people that live in the land are strong. The ha'arim v'tzuros gdolos ma'od. The cities are very fortified, and so on and so forth. What's the but? If they're reporting the facts are that the land is flowing with milk and honey, and it's occupied by strong people. What's the but? The but means it's unconquerable. It's a beautiful land, very luscious land, rich land, fine fruits, but will never happen. It was unconquerable. That word FS, that was the chet. That was an editorial judgment. You know, in newspapers, you have the news articles and you have the editorials. Right? The news articles are supposed to be facts. The editorials are opinion. But nowadays, you read the newspaper, you know that the news articles are also editorials. They're also filled with opinion. They purport to be objective reporting of the facts, but we know that it's not really that way. There has been a decline in that sense. I think if you go back to newspapers 30 years ago, they tried to stick to the facts to a greater extent than today. Today, it's fair game. Whatever position you're pushing, whether it's conservatism or liberalism, the stories themselves have that slant. So here, they were meant to report the facts. They weren't meant to editorialize. They weren't meant to give their opinions. But they came back and they said, FS, but, meaning, but it's unconquerable, and therefore, we'll never have it. Kalev then silenced the people and attracted their attention. And he offered the alternative report, which is that the land is conquerable. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, he'll enable us to conquer it. And then the 10 responded, and they said no, that it's not so. And the pasuk says that after that, after the public meeting, it says that the Vayotziu dibas haaretz, they brought forth slander about the land, and they told the Bnei Yisrael that it's an eretz ochelas yoshveha, it's a land which consumes its inhabitants, and so on and so forth. Now the Ramban explains that in public they didn't slander the land. In public, in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu, they would not say anything that Moshe Rabbeinu could easily refute. So publicly, the only point they made was that it's unconquerable. The people are too strong. But the land itself is a wonderful land. But then, after the public meeting broke up, the Meraglim went from 10 to 10 privately and began telling people, you know, there's more to the story than we mentioned in the public meeting. In the public meeting, we mentioned the fact that it's unconquerable. The truth is, it's undesirable. It's a land which consumes its inhabitants. All the people are very, very large there. So you might think, well, that's a nice thing. They're very large. Large, robust people. And the answer is, to the contrary. The reason everyone there is very large is because people that are not that robust cannot survive there. It's too harsh, too rugged. So therefore, the only survivors are the people that are the ones of very strong physical constitutions. And as a consequence of this dibas haaretz, this lashon hara about Eretz Yisrael, it says that the entire tzibur wailed, the entire community wailed. So at this point, what was the sin of the Meraglim? The sin of the Meraglim was really twofold. Number one, they made an initial judgment that Eretz Yisrael was unconquerable, and this is a lack of faith. In fact, the Gemara in Maseches Erechim says this lack of faith was so extreme that it's almost to the point of total blasphemy. When they said Chazak hu mimenu, they didn't mean it is stronger than we are. It's to be understood that the land is stronger than he is, than God is. Kavyachal was if to say, Afilu balabayis and yachal otzekela misham. Even God, who is the owner, cannot remove the inhabitants from there. So their judgment, the land is unconquerable, was not just a lack of self-confidence, and not just a lack of faith in God. It was pashut a blasphemy. It was a kfira in God's omnipotence. That's how the Gemara says it. And then there was lashon hara about the quality of the land. That the land, in fact, is an awful land. It's a land which consumes its inhabitants. We know the famous Midrash Rashi brings, that when they went there, they saw there were many funerals taking place. So why was that? HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted that the Meraglim should be able to travel unnoticed. So he distracted the people by having many people die about that time, and different people were preoccupied with their mourning, with the funerals, so they wouldn't notice that there were strangers that were reconnoitering the land. But the Meraglim took that to mean the opposite, that so many people are dying. They're dropping like flies. There must be something wrong with the land. So this is a scorning of Eretz Yisrael. And the Pasuk in Tehillim emphasizes this idea. Vayimasu be'eretz chemda. They scorned the coveted land. So really it's a twofold chet. Why was it necessary to slander the land? I mean, why wasn't it enough to stick with their original point that the land is unconquerable? Well, the answer is this. The answer is that people often muster up the strength to do something very, very difficult if they see it as being very, very desirable. As if I would tell you that if you could repeat this shir when it's over, word for word, you'll get $1 million. You would be transcribing, every word for $1 million. It's worth it. If I would tell you that if you could repeat this year when it's over, you'll get a nickel, you say, for a nickel, I'll relax. I'm not going to strain myself. Because if it's something which is really worth having, then we'll take the risks and we'll expose ourselves to the dangers. So therefore, it wasn't enough that the Meraglim should say the land is unconquerable. The Jews might have said to that, okay, it's difficult, we see that, but it's worth it. So the Meraglim, in order to reinforce their position, had to make a case that it isn't worth it. The land itself is undesirable. Now this was lashon hara, this was slander that was totally manufactured. It was very interesting. The Mepharshim point out that there are two expressions for lashon hara we find in the Chumash. By Yosef, it says Vayave Yosef es dibasam ra. Yosef brought the evil report. Here it says Vayotziu. They produced the evil report. So the Mepharshim say it all depends. When the lashon hara is true, when the information is true, you're only transporting it from one place to the other place. A person here would see it, a person over there has no way of knowing it, so you transport the information from here to here. That's Vayave. As Yosef really saw the brothers doing things, he just conveyed it to Yaakov, so that's called Vayave. He brought the evil report. When you produce something out of nothing, when you invent the lashon hara, that's Vayotziu, you produce it. Right? The Meraglim produced it. It wasn't something that was true and just was transported. It was something that was a total invention. That's Vayotziu. The Gemara says a very interesting premise to this. The Gemara says that all the subsequent Goliaths, all the subsequent exiles, are really a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim. We'll talk about it a little bit later, why that is. And therefore, if you talk about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash, and the Golus to Bavel, and the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, the Roman exile, all of them are rooted in the Chet HaMeraglim. Because that night that the Meraglim slandered Eretz Yisrael and the people cried was the night of Tisha B'Av. And Chazal say that Atem b'chisem b'chiyesh lachinam, Hashem said to the Jewish people, you cried for nothing, I'll give you a reason to cry. And therefore all the Churbanos, all the destructions, all the Goliaths take place on that date of Tisha B'Av. So there's a connection. Megillas Eicha, which is the book that Yirmiyahu Navi wrote to lament the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, has several prakim that follow the order of the Aleph Beis. Eicha, Yoshva, Bacho, Sivke, Golsa, etc. In other words, the psukim, the first letters of the psukim correspond to the Aleph Beis. Except one very curious thing, that in two of the prakim, the letter Pei is before the letter Ayin. Very curious thing. In the Aleph Beis, right, you have Ayin Pei. But here, you have in two of the prakim Pei before the letter Ayin. So why is that? Very curious thing. So the answer is like this. Pei is the word peh, is the word mouth. It's peh. Pei is mouth. Ayin is the word eye. Now normally when you report something, first it begins with the eye. Right? You see something, and then you report it. That would be ayin pei, which is the correct order of the Aleph Beis. But since all the Goliaths were a consequence of the Chet HaMeraglim, and the Meraglim reported that which they did not see, they were higdimu peh la'ayin, Chazal say, they put their mouths before their eyes, because they said things that they did not in fact see. So to allude to that, in these two chapters of Lamentations about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, it puts the letter Pei before the letter Ayin. The mouth is before the eye. So they made this up. Yes?
So why did these 10 Meraglim do this? What's in it for
That's
them?
what we're talking about. Now, so the question is this. So when you read the Parsha, even keeping in mind that there is something made up, there are several possibilities of how to understand this Parsha. One possibility is this, that the judgment that it is unconquerable, that was an honest judgment, maybe a mistaken judgment. That was an honest judgment. But they really believed it was unconquerable. And they really believed that if the Jews would try to conquer it, it would be a disaster. So they have to be stopped at all costs. How do you stop them? If they're not going to believe the truth as we see it, and if they're going to be insistent on going on and trying to conquer the land despite our report, so how are we going to stop them? We have to save them from themselves. Mm-hmm. So we'll do that by making up something else. We'll make up Lashon Hara about the land. So therefore, one possible way of reading it is that the Rambam's report was, in a sense, half honest. When I say honest, I don't mean correct. They were mistaken, but it could be that it was half mistaken and half deliberate fabrication. Their judgment the land was unconquerable was their honest judgment. Now, it was a mistaken judgment. It was rooted perhaps in a lack of faith, a lack of emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it was honest. It wasn't a deliberate lie. But the diba sa'aretz, but the slander of the land, that was a deliberate fabrication. That's one possibility. That's a legitimate way of reading the story. There is another possibility that the whole thing was a lie. Because even their judgment that the land was unconquerable really was not true. They themselves knew that that was baloney, and they had an ulterior motive. Now, what might that ulterior motive have been? So the Zohar says a fantastic thing. Now, keep in mind, this is, again, just one approach to the Parsha. We could learn that it was an honest judgment, a mistaken judgment, but an honest judgment, rooted in a lack of faith. But it could be that the whole thing was made up and there was another concern. So the Zohar says like this. The Zohar says that these Meraglim, who were they? They were dignitaries. They were princes of their respective tribes. So it says in the Zohar that they felt that if we would go into Eretz Yisrael, we would lose our jobs. Because
the style of management wasn't really...
it was because we were appropriate leaders. We are appropriate leaders for the desert, but for Eretz Yisrael, we need bigger Nesiim, bigger leaders, and we'll lose our jobs. And therefore, to keep their jobs, they decided to prevent the entry into Eretz Yisrael. Now, this itself is scandalous when you think about it.
Oh yeah.
But the reality is, it is something that you see all the time. You know, people run for office, and what becomes first and foremost in their minds? Re-election. In other words, whether their policies are working, whether the policies aren't working, that's not negeya, that's unimportant. The most important thing is you keep your position. And that's what the Zohar says, that the Meraglim were bent on keeping their position. Now the question is this, what does the Zohar mean? Why did the Nesiim think that they weren't qualified to keep their jobs? They would have lost their jobs had they gone into Eretz Yisrael. And the answer is like this. That, you know, to live in a midbar, where you are eating man that comes from heaven, and you're drinking the miraculous waters of the Be'er, the spring of Miriam, that followed them around through the midbar, and all your needs are supplied, and your clothes don't need to be replaced, as Chazal tell us. Mr. Pasuk tells us really in Parshas Kisova. And what do they do all day? They learned Torah with Moshe Rabbeinu. They meditated. They reflected. It was a spiritual existence. To be the leader of such a generation is not a kunst. It's not a trick. It's fairly simple. If you're the Rosh Yeshiva v'Yeshiva, where every bacher is learning with great diligence, and he comes to davening on time, and he keeps out of trouble, it's no big deal to be a Rosh Yeshiva and Yeshiva like that. It says, but when the Jews would enter Eretz Yisrael, it was going to become much more complicated, There would be a necessity to merge spiritual values with
The physical.
material existence. Living in the land, farming the land, cultivating the land, building the land, defending the land, creating an economy. That's a much bigger challenge. To be able to live in a material world at the same time in harmony with your spiritual values is a very, very difficult thing. So the Meraglim felt, we're up to the challenge of leading our Shvatim in the Midbar. But Eretz Yisrael is going to require bigger Meraglim. We want to keep our jobs. Now the Netziv has a similar approach, and he puts it differently, but according to what we're saying, really the Zohar also is alluding to this. They wanted to retain the spiritual existence. They were frightened, not of the fact that the Canaanim were big, strong people. They were frightened about the prospect of living a material life. They wanted that spiritual existence, eating the man, drinking the bear, learning Torah, etc., being enveloped by the divine clouds of glory. That's what they wanted. They wanted that lofty spiritual existence. They were scared to face what, for lack of a better word, we call the real world. And therefore, this is why they concocted the whole scheme. So this is a possibility. This is a possible approach. But the other approach, again, as we said, is that there was a personality flaw in the Meraglim. There was a lack of faith. There was a lack of trust in the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore this judgment that Eretz Yisrael was unconquerable, although it was a mistaken judgment, was an honest judgment in the sense that they didn't deliberately make up the story. But in order to reinforce their judgment, to persuade the people of the judgment, they made up the lie about Eretz Yisrael. Yes?
Are these the same Meraglim who didn't bring the gifts for the Mishkan and then later on?
No, they're not the same Nesiim. Not the same ones. The names are different. Now, the interesting thing is that at this point of the story, we have the Meraglim give the majority report, Kalev gives the minority report, the Meraglim respond. At that point, there's no reaction yet. We don't find an extreme reaction on the part of Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't find Yoshua and Kalev doing anything dramatic. We find a vikuach, we find a debate. There are two sides, each presents their side of the story. Then, as the Ramban understands the Parsha, we have that night, we have the hidden discussions, where the Meraglim produce their lie, and the Jews are crying the entire night. That's the night of Tisha B'Av. And the next morning, they come to Moshe Rabbeinu. And here, pandemonium breaks loose. They come to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they say like this. And they say, Lumasnu be'eretz Mesayim of BaMidbar hazel lumasnu. If only we would have died in Egypt, or if only we would have died in the Midbar. It says, why is Hashem bringing us to this land that we be slaughtered by the sword? Now, it's very interesting that here in Parshas Shlach, it's phrased as a question. Why? Why? But in Parshas Devarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu recounts the story, Moshe Rabbeinu puts words in their mouths that are much more harsh. Not that they asked why, as if it's an unanswered question. They had an answer to the question. They said, B'sinas Hashem osanu, because God hates us. That's why God is doing this to us. The whole thing is a setup. He took us out of Mitzrayim to have us slaughtered in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Maharal on that Rashi asks the question. The Maharal asks in that Rashi that how could the Jews have thought such a silly thing? That it was all a setup. That God took them out of Mitzrayim to have them be slaughtered by the nations in Eretz Yisrael. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to slaughter them, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could let the Egyptians slaughter them. Maharal asks that question on Rashi. But the answer, l'chara, is Parshas. I don't understand what the Maharal is asking. The answer is very, very simple. See, it's one thing you're slaughtered. Really, you're slaughtered. It's something else when your expectations are raised, and then you're slaughtered. Right? So this is B'sinas Hashem Osana. God hates us so much, it wasn't enough to allow the Egyptians to slaughter us. That wouldn't have satisfied his hatred of us. He wanted to raise our expectations to the point that we really think we're going into the land flowing with milk and honey, and there we're going to get slaughtered. Right? That is God's hatred of us. Now, again, that's the kind of thing you don't want to say explicitly. So they put it diplomatically. Why is God doing this to us? But it wasn't, they were asking this for informational purposes. Their minds were made up. They had determined that God must really hate them. And the whole thing is a setup. And as a consequence, they say, Vayom Ishalachiv, each person said to his brother, Nitna Raish, let us appoint a head, V'nashuva Mitzrayim, and go back to Egypt. Now, when you read this, the simple explanation is that it's safer. In the Midbar, we can't stay. Right? You can't stay in the desert the rest of your life. It's uninhabitable. So you have to either go back or go forward. To go forward into Eretz Yisrael, slaughter. The only choice is to go back. I will be enslaved again. Okay. Better to be enslaved than to be slaughtered. So let's go back. So the simple explanation is let's go back because it is safer there. But if that is the case, then really the position they are taking is not any different or any worse than the position the Meraglim took the day before. When the Meraglim said that Eretz Yisrael is unconquerable, so what were they advocating? Okay, maybe they held you could stay in the Midbar. So we're only dealing with a very minor detail, that if Eretz Yisrael is unconquerable, what can you do? What are your options? Is it an option to stay in the Midrash? You have to go back to Mitzrayim. But it seems that as soon as the Jews introduce this possibility of going back to Mitzrayim, that's when the crisis really begins. At that point it says, Vayipol Moshe v'Aaron al pneihem. That Moshe and Aaron fall on their face in front of the entire congregation. And Yeshua ben Nun and Kaleb ben Yefuna tear their clothes. They tear Kriya. Now the question is, again, what happened today that didn't happen yesterday? Because yesterday, the Meraglim already gave their report that Eretz Yisrael is unconquerable. So if we're only discussing a question, okay, if we eliminate the possibility of going to Eretz Yisrael, so what are we going to do? Are we going to go back or are we going to stay where we are? That seems to be a minor detail. Why today is it such a crisis that Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces, Yeshua and Kaleb tear their clothes, and yesterday it seems that the vikuach, the entire discussion, the debate, was carried on in a spirit of great serenity, great calm. There's a Rashi, and Rashi says an amazing thing over here. Rashi says, when they said Nitna Raish v'nashuva Mitzrayim, Rashi says, V'ravaseinu pirshu loshon avodah zarah. Rashi says that this is an expression of idolatry. Nitna Raish doesn't simply mean let's appoint a new leader who will take us back to Mitzrayim. They said let's revert back to avodah zarah. Let's embrace idol worship. Well, now we understand what's going on. See, yesterday it was an issue of the failure of the Meraglim to understand God's omnipotence. And the Meraglim believed that there are limits to God's power. It's a terrible thing, but they weren't advocating abandoning God wholesale. But now the people are saying, Nitna Raish, let us introduce avodah zarah and forsake God. That was considered an intolerable crisis. If at this point Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces, Yeshua and Kaleb tear their clothes, this is considered a disaster. But how do you understand it? And what is this idea of let's embrace avodah zarah? How is that going to solve the problem? It seems to me an amazing thing, and I think that the Siv also understands it this way. You know, Judaism, entering Judaism is a one-way street. If a person converts to Judaism, you can become a ger, you can become a convert. You can't convert out of Judaism. That's the reality. There's no such thing as converting out of the religion. You can opt in, you can't opt out. In that sense, it's not a revolving door. That you can go in, you can go out. It's a one-way door. You can go in, once you're in, you can't go out. That's a fact we have to recognize. When the Jews stood at Har Sinai, and they accepted the Torah, and thereby became God's people, this is a one-way street. This is a commitment that cannot be abrogated. You cannot back out. But that is exactly what the Jews are trying to do over here. The Jews said like this: we committed ourselves to God. In exchange for what? In exchange for what God provided to us. God, first of all, took us out of Mitzrayim. And secondly, He promised to take us to Eretz Yisrael. In exchange for that, in exchange for our liberation and our being brought to Eretz Yisrael, we agreed we'll worship Him, we'll be beholden to Him, we'll be subject to His authority. But it's reversible. The process is reversible. We can back out. So they said, well, at this point it appears that this is a dead end. If we remain under God's authority, this is going to lead to slaughter. God is bringing us to Eretz Yisrael. He Himself is not powerful enough to bring us into the land. We're going to be slaughtered. So what is our choice at this point? To go back to Mitzrayim. But going back to Mitzrayim isn't just we're going back to Mitzrayim. Going back to Mitzrayim means we are turning the clock back. We are abrogating the covenant with God. Our obligations to God, our being subject to His authority, is all a consequence of the Yetzias Mitzrayim and the covenant at Sinai. If we go back to Mitzrayim, we have turned the clock back. Now we aren't beholden to Him. We aren't subject to His authority. There's nothing He can do to us. We're free. And that is a terrible blasphemy. That's much worse than what happened the day before. The day before, you had 10 people who made a theological error. They said that God is not all-powerful. It's a mistake. It's wrong. But it pales in comparison to what the Jews are saying now. The Jews are saying now, we're going to turn the clock back. We're going back to Egypt. That means we are no longer beholden to God, no longer committed to God. God has no control or authority over us. We're going back. That, of course, prompts Moshe Rabbeinu to tear his clothes, Aaron, to fall on their faces, and Yeshua and Kalev tear their clothes. And in fact, that's what the verse says. Kalev warns the people at that point, Ach b'Hashem al timrodu, don't rebel against God. And the Ramban is troubled. Who's talking about rebelling against God? Were the Raglim advocating rebellion against God? So the Netziv says, exactly yes. It was rebellion. In other words, the Nitna Reish, the let's point ahead and go back to Mitzrayim, really is advocating a rebellion against God. That we are going to opt out of the system. We are going to turn the clock back. We're going back to Mitzrayim and nullify the entire covenant. That is an act of rebellion, and that's what Kalev warned them.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Okay. They just experienced the 10 plagues, the Yom Suf, the God speaking, and the golden calf, and they still get into this position. Like, what did the Levites say? What did the Kohanim say? I mean, they must have thought they were insane. How could they come to this conclusion that God is leading them to die when they just went through an enormous, the world's most? Remember that's why we did the over-counting of the high level of spirituality.
That's exactly what I explained. That this group believed it was a setup. In other words, God hates us, and therefore He set us up.
And did all this for them.
He raised their expectations. He raised their expectations, and His plan is to slaughter us. In other words, it's not just that He's not strong enough to bring us in, right? He's devilish. In fact, maybe in theory He is strong enough. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to bring us into Eretz Yisrael.
But
He wants us to be slaughtered.
Could this have been suggested by like the mixed multitudes suggesting in the Yetzer Hara, or suggesting, remember they said that Moses was dead on the mountain? This is
Anything is possible, but Chazal don't say this about the Chet HaMeraglim. But the Chet HaMeraglim, they seem to say that this is the way it is.
Oh, wow.
In any case, the story unfolds. Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to intercede on their behalf, and Moshe Rabbeinu is able to get God to suspend the sentence. But the generation that was of adult age at this time is condemned to die in the Midbar. Now, but God does it in such a way that it will not be a Chilul Hashem. See, Moshe Rabbeinu makes a very, very strong argument. Moshe Rabbeinu says that if you wipe out the Jews in the desert, the nations of the world will say, oh, you see, God wasn't powerful enough to bring them into Eretz Yisrael, and that's why he slaughtered them. So God says, okay, you're right. I can't do it in a way that demonstrates weakness. So what will I do? I will have the Jews wander in the desert for a number of years, and everyone will die a natural death. The entire generation will die, but only when they reach the age of 60 years old. So there were 50-year-olds who died 10 years later. There were 40-year-olds who died 20 years later. There were 30-year-olds who died 30 years later. The 20-year-olds, who were the youngest adults, died 40 years later. That's why the Jews had to wander 40 years in the desert. So that the people that were just barely adults, just turned 20, would reach 60 before they died. 60 in those days was considered a full life. Life expectancy was not longer than that for an average person. And there were individuals who lived longer. Moshe Rabbeinu lived to 120. But generally, people live till 60. So if a person dies at 60, no one would say he died prematurely. He lived out a full life.
So where's the 70?
What? That's in Tillim, right? And there the Pasuk says, the days of our lives are at most 70 years in the Gvuras, and if they're exceptionally strong, 80 years. That 70 already is a exceptional lifetime, 80 is even more so. 60, no one would say he died prematurely at 60. Like nowadays, life expectancy is somewhat longer, right? But if a person dies at 80, even though there are many people who live till 85, no one would say that his death was premature. It's an age that is considered, if a person dies at 70 nowadays, you say, he was young, yeah, he's only 70, right? When I was growing up, when I was a kid, people died in their 60s. It wasn't considered,
Really?
Wasn't considered that premature.
So if Moshe Rabbeinu had not made that argument about not having a Chilul Hashem, Hashem would not have minded having that reception? Or
No, this is always the question. When you have Moshe Rabbeinu interceding on behalf of the Jewish people, and what if Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't have thought of it? Right? Or is it like the teacher who gets the student to give the right answer? I don't know. That's a tough question. I think there are hints from Chazal that really what is happening is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is extracting this from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu knows what God wants to hear, and therefore Moshe says it. And that's a great schus on the part of Moshe Rabbeinu that he intercedes on behalf of the people. But this is the argument he makes, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu sets up the system that they should have to wander for 40 years in the desert. But it says something very, very cryptic. Because if that's the way it worked, then you would say like this, that the children really were not being punished. The children who were under 20 had to wander 40 years in the desert because they had to wait for their parents to die. But it's not that they were guilty of some sin and therefore they have to be punished. But strangely enough, the verse doesn't say that. The verse says something very, very curious that implies that the children also were being punished. It says in the verse that when God delivered the sentence, he says the following, Uvenechem yiyu rayim BaMidbar 40 shana. Your children will graze in the desert for 40 years. That's like an interesting expression, to graze in the desert. And the English says to roam in the desert, but to be roa is like sheep that graze. V'nosu es znusechem, and they will bear your wanderings. They will bear your wanderings until you die. So the verse seems to say that
Sins of the father of the child.
somehow they're going to bear the guilt.
Yeah.
Why are the children bearing the guilt? Now, it's obvious that the pasuk is coming to answer a very serious question. Because let's say it was necessary for the parents to die in the Midbar. They couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael, and they couldn't die before the age of 60, because that would have been a chilul Hashem. So therefore, they had to wander for 40 years. Why did the children have to wait in the desert with them? Why couldn't the children go into Eretz Yisrael? The old generation could stay behind, the younger generation go into Eretz Yisrael, and problem is solved. If the younger generation was totally innocent, I think the answer is like this. We're really dealing with three different things over here. As we explained, the Chesed Meraglim had three components. First of all, there was a rejection of Eretz Yisrael. This was the acceptance of the Meraglim's evil report, their fabricated report about the quality of the land. That is the verse in Tehillim, Vayimasu be'eretz chemda, they scorned the coveted land. Now, the Eretz Yisrael was something which God had promised them, God had praised to them, and all of a sudden they rejected. That's a scorning of God's gift of Eretz Yisrael. Then there's another question, which is a lack of faith. This is the acceptance of the Meraglim's report that Eretz Yisrael is unconquerable. That's the second sin. Then third is the rebellion of saying, let's go back to Mitzrayim. Nitna Raish V'Neshuv Mitzrayim. If you look in the Sforno and the Ibn Ezra, on this verse, which says that the children have to bear the sin of their fathers, they specify it was specifically the sin of saying Nitna Raish V'Neshuv Mitzrayim. Let's point ahead and go back to Mitzrayim. In other words, not the other two components. It was specifically this one that the children have to bear the suffering for. I think the understanding is like this, that there are two types of sins that people commit. There are sins that are rooted in personality flaws. A person has a personality flaw. A person is lustful. A person has desire for pleasure. As a result, he may commit an illicit act. He'll eat something he shouldn't eat. He'll engage in a sexual relationship he shouldn't engage in because he has desire. That's a personality flaw. It's a flaw of character. Then there are sins which are rooted in flaws in our philosophical beliefs. Because there are things that we've failed to understand, failed to learn. And as a result, our values are not correct values. Personality traits, character flaws, are not necessarily transmitted by parents to their children. If a parent has a personality flaw, the children won't necessarily have it, which is a relief for all of us who are parents. There are children uncondemned to suffer for our sins. And why is that? That's a very simple reason. Where do our personalities come from? So the Rambam writes in the Shemona Prakim that our personality traits come from conditioning, from our environment, from our experiences. Repetitive behavior tends to entrench certain personality traits. Now we know that parents and children don't live in the same world. Now, especially imagine the children of immigrants. Right? The formative years for their parents were in a foreign country. The formative years of their children were in a free land. Very, very different experiences. So the fact that the parents were conditioned in a certain way doesn't mean the children are conditioned in a certain way. This is something which all children of immigrants experience. Our parents have a different attitude towards food than we have. Because to them, every scrap of food was precious, wasn't to be wasted. You know, clean your plate. People are starving in Europe, you know, that kind of thing. And food was very, very precious. To us, to we who were born into the bounty of America, we have a totally different attitude about food. Right? What's so bad? You waste food, you throw it away, you don't like it, you get rid of it. Eat something else. You know, I remember as a kid coming into the house, looking for something to eat. And I'll tell you, my parents had a very well-stocked kitchen. You had every goodie imaginable was there. But you know, I had an 11-year-old kid, you're looking around, just the one thing you want is missing. So I go through all the cabinets, I'm banging the doors, I'm looking for what, you know. So my father would say to me, "You're hungry? Eat bread." You know, for people that grew up in Europe and lived through the Holocaust, if you have bread, you're nothing to complain about. Well, you're looking just for the candy, just for the type of potato chip with the flavor that you're hungry? Eat bread. Our experiences are totally different than their experiences. And therefore, the personality flaws of the parents aren't necessarily the personality flaws of the children. Now let me offer a conjecture. Now, the Jews witnessed the great miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, the splitting of the Red Sea, and so on and so forth. But the people who were somewhat older already, could these miraculous events change the very deeply entrenched attitudes that were created in years of slavery? I would suggest that the people that were somewhat older, there was a sense of hopelessness, a sense of despair that might not have been changed even by the miracles of the Kriyas Yamsuf. Whereas the younger people, who were still essentially children, who probably did not ever work as slaves yet, when they saw these miracles, this was a boost to their self-confidence and their trust in God and so on and so forth. So the fact that the forefathers lacked faith is not a reason to assume that the children will lack faith. The children were conditioned by a different set of experiences than the forefathers were. Likewise, when we talk about the issue of attitudes towards Eretz Yisrael, you know, it could be very possible that the children and the adults would have different attitudes towards this. Maybe the children are more idealistic. Maybe the parents are more cynical. You know, that often happens when you become an adult. You become more doubting, more questioning, more suspicious. You're a child, you're more trusting. So if you hear these reports about Eretz Yisrael, how beautiful it is, how rich it is, how lush it is, so the children will say, yeah, and the adults will say, yeah, and nechtige tog, as they say in Yiddish. So the fact that the adults scorned Eretz Yisrael, the adults above 20, doesn't mean that the adults under 20 will scorn Eretz Yisrael. So when we talk about those aspects of the sin, even if the above 20s were condemned to suffer, there's no reason that the under 20s should be condemned to suffer. So therefore, we would have expected that let the old-timers stay in the BaMidbar and die out over the 40 years, but the younger ones go into Eretz Yisrael. Why should they be forced to wander? But there's one component of the sin, as we explained, which may be transmitted. Because as we said, the rebellion of Nitna Reish Neshuva Mitzrayim, let's embrace Avodah Zarah, right, is rooted in a philosophical error, which is that Judaism is a revolving door. You can opt in, you can opt out. And that is a very, very dangerous mistake. A very dangerous mistake. And it's interesting, the Maharal points out that this is a mistake that is so serious that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself tried to address it at the time the Torah was given. It's a fantastic thing. Chazal tell us that when the Jews stood at Har Sinai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the mountain over them like a barrel. Chazal say, they stood at the foot of the mountain. God held the mountain over like a barrel. So the Maharal asks the question, we know historically, if you reconstruct the chronology, that one day before the revelation, the Jews had already said Nasa v'nishma. They already voluntarily accepted the Torah. Why was it necessary to hold the mountain over their heads? There should be an element of duress, of pressure, of force. So the Maharal gives an amazing answer to this question. He says like this. He says that if God would have relied on the voluntary acceptance, there could have been a mistake, a very serious mistake. The Jews could have thought, well, yes, we accepted the Torah, but we just as well could have not accepted the Torah. And since our obligation is only a function of our voluntary acceptance, the same way we opted in, we can opt out. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the mountain over their heads as if to say that you have no choice in the matter. Your obligation is not because of your voluntary acceptance, it's because I'm imposing the obligation on you. Now, the fact that God wanted to transmit this lesson doesn't mean everyone learned it. You know, anybody who's ever taught in the classroom understands that the fact you try to teach a lesson doesn't mean everybody in the class has learned the lesson. According to our analysis tonight, that is exactly the error that was made at the time of the Meraglim. They said you can opt out. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is leading us to our deaths. Let's turn the clock back. We'll go back to Mitzrayim, and we will no longer be beholden to him. That's a very serious error, but it's not just a personality flaw. That might have been the motive. It's a hashkafa flaw. It's a philosophical flaw. That has to be corrected. Now, one thing we know about the years in the Midbar, that were very different, as we said, than the years in Eretz Yisrael. In the Midbar, the whole Midbar was one big yeshiva. That's what they were doing in the Midbar. They were eating man and learning Torah. If any errors had to be worked through, the Midbar was the place to do it. Once they go into Eretz Yisrael and everyone goes his own way, and this person farms his land and he sits under his fig tree and so on and so forth, that is not a situation which is auspicious for correcting theological errors. And therefore, the children had to remain in the Midbar themselves for 40 years, to unlearn the error that they had been taught. To understand that Torah is binding, it is obligatory, it is imposed upon us. We do not have the ability to opt out. So it could be there is an element that even necessitated the children learning. Now, needless to say, this sin of the Meraglim is, as we said, this is the sin which has had the greatest consequence for the course of Jewish history. Because as Chazal tell us, since we cried for nothing that Tisha B'Av, all the subsequent exiles, all the subsequent persecutions come. God says, you cried for nothing, I'll give you a reason to cry. Now that itself sounds very petty. Like, you cried for nothing, I'll give you a reason to cry. I mean, that's how God operates? Now, the commentaries explain that's just a cute way of putting it. The real answer is that all the exiles are rooted in the Chet HaMeraglim. Why is that? So let's share with you this thought, and this is we'll conclude with it. The Malbim says this, but others say it. The Chet of the Meraglim, bottom line, was a Chet of Chilul Hashem. It was a desecration of God's name. Because it conveyed the message that even the Jews, who were essentially God's people, believe that God is powerless to bring the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. That sin has to be rectified. There has to be a demonstration of God's omnipotence that will rectify this message, which the Jews conveyed, that they reject God's omnipotence. What is the greatest demonstration of God's power over the course of history? I think many people would tell you it is the survival of the Jewish people. The survival of the Jewish people in exile is the greatest demonstration of God's omnipotence. Meaning, if you find a people that is reviled, hated, who b'chol dor v'dor, when every generation they rise against us to destroy us, and yet this nation not only survives but thrives, that is a demonstration of God's omnipotence. You may ask the question, why didn't God save everybody? Why doesn't God destroy the tormentors? Those are all good questions. But the fact is that nation after nation after nation has been determined to destroy us, and we've been saved and we've survived. That is a demonstration of God's power. Says the Malbim, that is the Kiddush Hashem, that is the sanctification of God's name, which rectifies the Chilul Hashem of the Chet HaMeraglim. And that's what Rashi and Chazal are telling us, that we cried for nothing. We made a Chilul Hashem. So we have to rectify that. We rectify that by following the entire course of Jewish history. Persecution after persecution after persecution, which we survive, sometimes easily, sometimes by the skin of our teeth. But we survive, and that is the demonstration of God's ultimate omnipotence. That is the Kiddush Hashem that rectifies the Chilul Hashem, the desecration of the generation of the Meraglim. But needless to say, this is again the event which has had the greatest impact in Jewish history. Everything is rooted back to this chet. All suffering, all persecutions, all exiles are really a consequence of this chet. And of course, this really is the answer to the question that people ask, that the very religious community never was in favor of establishing a separate day for Holocaust commemoration. And they always felt that it could be incorporated into the observances of Tisha B'Av, but there shouldn't be a separate day for it. And the question is, why is that? What would be so bad if there'd be a separate day? Now, I think this is exactly the idea, that we have to understand that the Holocaust is not a unique event in Jewish history. I think some people would like to think that it is really something unique, unprecedented, unparalleled, totally different, therefore deserving of its own day of commemoration. The truth is, it is just the most recent, maybe not even the most recent by now, but it was just a fairly recent demonstration of a fact of Jewish history, which is a reality. That b'chol dor v'dor omdim leinu l'chalaseinu. All of that is rooted in the Churban Beis HaMikdash, which in turn is rooted in the Chet HaMeraglim, which of course took place on Tisha B'Av. And therefore we have to understand that there's no more appropriate day, right, to commemorate the Holocaust or any Jewish suffering than Tisha B'Av. Because all the sufferings, all the persecutions are rooted in the events of that first Tisha B'Av. Therefore this is the day that all suffering, all Jewish calamities are recalled and recounted, because we understand that they all are rooted in that very, very bitter experience of the Rabbi. Right, thank you very much.